All right. Good morning, everybody. We're letting folks in. It is right at 10 o'clock. It's a beautiful Saturday morning in Nashville. I hope everybody has a really good weekend. I think it's going to be hot again. Just the way it is right now. Everybody try to stay cool, but it looks like it's going to be, again, a pretty weekend here. Our guest today is Shani Dowell, who is the founder and CEO of POSSIP. Shani, good morning. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm getting signs that say very hot, but
it is. I already sweat this morning.
Yeah, well, so am I, and I haven't even been outside. Shani, as most people know who watch this show, we usually talk about something irrelevant for a few minutes while we're letting people in. Usually I'll ask about something that's on the wall behind people, but there is nothing on. Where are you?
Yeah, so it's I walked in and was wondering about this. So this is our office space in Center 615, which is in East Nashville, and there's literally nothing on almost any wall. And so
there's a thermostat. I just saw
there's a thermostat, there's a plant, but yeah, there's not much on the wall. So we've thought about painting, what we want to put up here. We were, before the pandemic, we were in the Entrepreneur Center, and then we grew over the pandemic, and so we have this space, but we haven't quite figured out how we want to set it up. So it's kind of like that entrepreneurial set too, where you don't want to overspend on office space. So yeah.
I have a lot of pictures that are just pictures of me, if you want to put one up. No, I have a lot of artwork that I'm just sitting around. I can give you some if you'd like.
Cool. Yeah.
Okay. It's I'll bring some over one day, and then you can pick something out. Awesome. But you do have sticky notes on the wall.
That's we have pocket stickers, and yeah. So and some, well, yeah, that's it.
So that's all. And tell me a little
bit.
We've
got full bookshelves. So.
The space you're in is wait a minute. What is it? 615.
Center 615. So it's kind of like a co-working space. So there are lots of different companies and organizations in here. It's in East Nashville off of Gallatin Road. So yeah, it's a good space. It's kind of like a co-working space, but where you can have an individual office.
Very good.
We've got a team of about 8 who come into the office here.
And do you have a lot of people that come in? I mean, does everybody come in, or do you have kind of a hybrid model at this point?
Hybrid model. We typically will kind of let each other know when we're coming in. So if one person comes in, then like 4 or 5. I try to come in at least 3 days a week. It's better, to be honest, during the cooler times, because we have great outdoor space, and so we'll go and sit outdoors. But when it's hot, we're all in here. And of course, with the pandemic, trying to just manage who's where when thing.
Okay, I got it. And then before we started, Joyce and I were talking about your earrings. They're very nice. So what are they?
Actually, I got them. We spent about 3 weeks this summer in Guanajuato, which is a state kind of in the middle of Mexico, and got them in Guanajuato. So Guanajuato is a place that I had spent a summer about 28 years ago when I was right out of high school. Between high school and college, I spent a summer there with a program called Amigos. And so, yeah, we were back there for 3 weeks. Taking language classes, exploring. So that's where I got them.
Very cool. All right. Well, we're going to talk about all the stuff you've been up to, including POSSIP. So our guest today is Shani Dowell. Welcome, everybody. This should be a very interesting conversation, because POSSIP, to me, is a very interesting entity, and it does some very interesting stuff. So we're going to get into that in just a second. Again, it's beautiful outside. It should be a great weekend, and there were obviously a lot of stuff going on in the news this week, council stuff. We have a council meeting on Tuesday. Lots of stuff in the news today about the Republican National Convention. It looks like it may be headed to Milwaukee, but we'll see. I think there'll probably be discussions ongoing about that, and lots of stuff coming up on the council calendar Tuesday night. So anyway, everybody keep informed. All right, Shani Dowell, founder and CEO of POSSIP. We're glad you're here. The first question that I always ask to everyone, all my guests, is tell us a little bit about yourself. Where you're from, and besides going to the Mexico that summer after high school, what else have you been doing all this time?
Yeah, so I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's where my dad and his 3 brothers are from. when I was 5, we moved down to Houston, which is where my mother and her 7 siblings are from. So grew up in Houston, 1st through 12th grade. My dad was a small business owner doing research and evaluation work. My mom was a therapist who worked mostly with students who were in the juvenile system, and then also did family and marital counseling. After high school, went to college. I went to public schools for 1st to 12th grade in Houston, went to college at Howard University in DC. Right after college, moved to Boston to do strategy consulting with Bain and Company, and did that for about a year before I realized, hey, before I realized like I just like to be a little closer to the action. And so I left Bain and started working with an organization called the Posse Foundation. Posse sends high school students to college on full tuition leadership scholarships. And so they had been in New York for a decade, and Boston was going to be their first national replication. I think it would be a great program to have in Nashville. But so helped start the Posse Boston branch. So did that for a couple of years, then went off to business school out in California at Stanford. And then after that, did nonprofit consulting. That led me to working with an organization called KIP, to help school leaders get their school started. That's where I met my husband, who was living in Nashville, getting KIP started in Nashville. And so my job was helping school leaders across the South. So I was still living in Houston, but I was, Vanderbilt University. Interesting fact, thanks, Timothy put in the chat that their Posse scholars at Vanderbilt University. Fun fact, Vanderbilt was the first welcoming university for Posse. So it's probably been, gosh, I don't even know how many years Posse's been at Vanderbilt, but one of the original Posse scholars at Vanderbilt, forgive me for the,
Okay.
but one of the original Posse scholars at Vanderbilt, she was president of Ithaca College for a time. So came from New York, came down to Nashville to Vanderbilt through Posse. And so they do amazing things, and have had an amazing impact both staying in Nashville and across the country. So yeah, Posse is an awesome program. So was working at KIP, helping school leaders across the South get their school started. And this was back in 2004 to 2005. And really got motivated through that work and seeing what was possible in schools. I mentioned I had gone through public schools K through 12, and a lot of my experience had found me even in schools that were racially diverse, being one of only a few Black students in more advanced classes, and knowing that a lot of times my cousins who are similarly, smart, talented, gifted, not being expected of anything, that, going to school without textbooks, without expectations. And so seeing KIP schools and seeing, really high quality schools led me to be inspired to teach. And so I actually joined Teach for America as a teacher. I taught in Houston, and I taught middle schoolers, English language learners, math, 7th and 8th grade math, and then got engaged, got married, moved to Nashville. So I moved to Nashville in 2008, and so I've been here since. So I guess back then I would have been a new transplant, but now in Nashville terms, I've been here for a relatively long time. And so we've raised and have 2 kids. We live in East Nashville, have lived over East Nashville, Inglewood, and Goodlettsville are kind of the 3 places we've lived over the course of our time here. And worked at Teach for America for a number of years, first on our national recruitment team, recruiting non-traditional people like me who had been out of college for some time, but were having kind of a wind and a desire to have an impact, and to use some of our more mature energy towards teaching. And then ended up leading the Teach for America Nashville region when we were first getting started here in Nashville, and did that for about 5 years. So a lot of my professional work has been in education, teacher recruitment and development, as well as nonprofit leadership. So yeah.
All right. So you've been lots of different places. You went
in a lot of cities. Yeah.
You went from Texas to Washington, D.C. You went to Boston. You worked for an entity out of New York. You ended up in California at Stanford. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. And lived out there, for a little bit after. Mm-hmm.
All right. So where have you not been? Well, you haven't spent a lot of time in like Minnesota or Wisconsin or Michigan. Right?
No, it's funny. In fact, when I was applying to colleges, I thought about applying to a college in Minnesota, and my dad made it very clear that they would not visit us because it's too cold. So visit me. So.
Okay, well, that's one thing that take into consideration in making decisions about going to college is how cold it is.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So tell me, okay, so you've been here about 14 years in Nashville. Tell us about POSSIP. How did that get started? Obviously, your background is intertwined in education. Um, Tell me about how this thing got started and what you're doing with it.
Yeah. So it's really a dinner table conversation in October of 2016. And anyone who has been a teacher or worked in schools in any way, and even parents, know that October is a very dark, it can be a very dark month. You've been at school for a couple of months. Luckily now with the balanced calendar, it made it a lot better in Nashville because we actually do have a break in October, but a lot of times there's no break, the daytime's getting shorter. So anyways, we were in that space, and my husband, who I mentioned, who runs KIP Nashville, had a parent issue, and we were talking at the dinner table about it. And so by this time, we have two kids who are in schools, they're in different schools, but this parent is very frustrated, and so it's creating some stress. So as he and I are kind of talking about the conversation, I said, well, what's this parent's issue? And as we talked about it, I was like, oh, I thought that was a small issue at some point. And what systems are there for her to share it? And we went back and forth and realized, well, there's email, there's Carline, but there's not necessarily an existing system or even a prompt. A lot of times, there's this idea of like, how can you deal with an issue when it's a pinch before it gets to be like this bigger issue? And so a lot of times you have to know that it's an issue. So all of that to say, there wasn't necessarily an easy way for her to share. And then I said, well, she has, she may not be sharing this feedback in the best way because she was calling and yelling at a lot of people along the chain, but you have trend data to know if other parents feel that way. And we went back and forth and we're like, oh, well, no, because if you don't have a system to collect that information, it's hard to even retroactively go back and see if there's any trend data. And then he said, and this is really important, especially given this time, he said, this makes my teacher's job so hard. They work so hard and they only hear from parents when things are bad. And so that really convicted me as someone who'd had some great experiences with my kids' schools and never had taken the time, one, never considered that someone else is yelling at a teacher who I see is working so hard. But then two, never taking the time to just share the stories that I hear when I pick up my kids at the end of the day. So those three things really came to the same core issue, which is we haven't created a vehicle for parents to share or for school administrators to get that information in a digestible way. And so we've created a really full of friction kind of relationship between the folks who really are on the same page for their kids. And so out of that dinner table conversation in October of 2016, just thought, wow, what if we made it really easy for parents to share? What if we did, as a teacher, you have an exit ticket at the end of the week where you try to see like, okay, did my kids learn what I tried to teach this week? So what if we had a similar concept for parents at the end of the week, ask, hey, how was your experience this week? What went well, what didn't? And then make it such that school and district administrators can actually get that information and do something with it. Because what happens a lot of times now is a school, someone answers the phone and on the other end, you've got someone yelling. And in that moment, your humanity kicks in and all you try to, you're just trying to defend yourself and either kind of fight or flight. But if you can get a report and read it and say, let me call this parent. Now I have their context and I was able to get some other context. Let me call them and follow up. You can have a lot more of a productive conversation. And you can also see that everything that every parent thinks isn't negative. You can see that, oh, actually over half of the things that we get in this are positive, and look at all these, they appreciate what we're doing. They understand the complexity of what we're doing. That doesn't mean they don't have some ideas on ways that things can be better or some specific needs for their child. But that was really the genesis of the idea back in October of 2016. So in January, I went to my kids' school to say, hey, I've got this idea. Can we explore it? So we sent home flyers and asked parents if they wanted to participate. Got about 300 parents who did. And so we started sending, I would use SurveyMonkey and a texting platform, and I would send a text on a Friday with a link to SurveyMonkey, and then they would answer it. And then I would make the reports over the weekend. And then on that Monday, I would send it to the school administration. So that's kind of the beginning of it.
All right. So you came up with this concept, you tried it out in your kid's school, and it started working. And maybe, I was going to say, what were you sending out? You were sending out a SurveyMonkey, but were you sending out just tell us how things were, or were you saying this week we did this at the school? So you were letting the parents know, you were kind of giving an update on what was going on at the school during the week and then asking for their opinion?
Well, no, our only kind of goal, because one of the things I found is I went out and tried to see like my first thought when I had the idea was, surely this must exist. Like clearly there's a way for parents to routinely share their ideas, thoughts, and feedback. And as I looked around, I realized there's actually not. There's tons of systems that are pushing out information. But some of what our systems have a lot of paternalism built into them, and so there was a lot of pushing out of information, but not a lot of ways to gather. So we were very much so focused on how can we hear from parents. And so what the question was is, are you happy with your scholars experience this week? And so then they would click on the Survey Monkey, and then there would be follow up. What praise do you have? What feedback? And then do you want your name shared or not? There are some other questions we had that over time we've changed for a couple of reasons. One is because we changed the link, like where you put the link to a fully chatbot kind of text experience. If you take it by your phone, and then there's a separate web experience if you take it by the internet. And part of why we did that is because, it's what we, about a third of low-income families don't have steady access to Wi-Fi or smartphone. And so making sure that, everyone's got a phone that can text, even a non-smartphone. And so that was really important for us, that we be able to access all families.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions about that. So I think you sent out the original request to see who wanted to be involved. You got about 300 requests, affirmative responses back. Sometimes you worry about the parents that are heavily involved. They're going to let you know anyway, but they're going to be involved. You worry about sometimes the parents that really aren't involved. How many of the 300, how many families or how many parents were at the school? Did you get about half, or was it more than half?
So the 300 probably represented a little over half of the parents, probably 75% of parents who just signed up to participate. And then after that, we didn't know about, any kind of we tried to ask for as little information as possible. So we didn't know a lot about demographics so what we did is we had the list and we showed it to the school administrators to say, how representative is this of your school population? And so what they said back is it's actually pretty representative. Now, what we found is there's different, to kind of what you're getting to, there are definitely differences in, how much they share, how frequently they share. But I think that also gives you a great starting point, because part of what the reflection then becomes is, one, we found that the more information parents have, the better they're able to engage. So we found in some schools, if schools don't have good systems of sharing information out, or even telling parents what they should expect of the school, how do they know how to hold them accountable to that, or what feedback they should share back? So that's one of the things we found is if parents don't have a lot to share back, they often don't know what's happening within the school, or even what the school is expecting or hoping for. And the other thing that a lot of people take for granted who spend their jobs writing and getting asked their opinion is that, we make the assumption that people feel entitled or even know that they have the right to share their opinion. And so that's the other part of the work that schools can do once they see who is sharing or who isn't sharing, is how do we create a community or a culture where every parent knows they're entitled to share their opinion. The other thing we did was to make sure that, so the surveys go out now that we built kind of more formalized technology, it goes out in over 100 languages. And the ability for parents to share, and for language to not be a barrier to sharing. And that's been really huge. I mean, especially working in some of our districts where we just ran a pulse check for a district and 97% of the respondents were in Spanish. So, really not trying to remove as many barriers as we can for allowing folks to access power in many ways by being able to share their voice.
Okay, so obviously this thing has grown much bigger than just the one school. Let me ask you, I guess, one other question about the initial efforts, and that would be, how did you, when you pulled the information back, particularly from a Survey Monkey, how did you disseminate the information to the right people so they would see? And was there any way of, once if you got something really specific on an issue that really bothered people, could they actually go back and try to find out more information?
Well, the good thing about our first kind of partner was that it was a well-run school. My kid's school is, so a couple of things. So first, parents are prompted, and now we work with staff and students as well. Parents are prompted for first a quantitative question. Are you happy with the school this week? Yes, mostly no. And it's intentionally an accessible question. Sometimes we'll have people who are kind of want a more complicated question, but it's intentionally simple and something that anyone can answer. So that's the first question. Then they're prompted, open-ended for praise or feedback. And it's, again, intentionally simple question, but all sorts of things come in. And that, those first, like just reading those reports, any report is a super beautiful experience, because you see things like, it made such a difference to my child when her teacher brought her a journal because she was struggling with anxiety. Like, this is something the school administrator would never know that a teacher did this, because this is like a small, beautiful act happening in the classroom. Or feedback, like where a parent said, the front office is making fun of my daughter's name when I came to pick her up, and that hurts because I chose her name, because I think it's beautiful. So those are things, the 1,000 things happen in a school day in any organization, really. And so to be able to elevate that. Now, to your question though about how do you organize it, because it can be very overwhelming. So all of the comments are broken down into the 4 drivers of what we think make for great schools: academics, operations, community and culture, and teachers and staff. And so both the positive and the constructive. So, and then they're sub-bucketed under those categories. So under operations, you might have communications, and under communications, you might have sub-buckets. And part of how we're able to do that is our technology takes it about 70 to 80% of the way. And then we have a team of reporters who are former educators or current educators who work part-time helping tag and then also come up with recommendations for the schools to make it really accessible. So then one of the things that happens next is it goes to the school. And so this is something that we think a lot about. So some school administrators have a very clear system of what they do with it, who they bring into the tent, and how they follow up with it. The reality is others are less kind of developed in that way. So that's something that we think a lot about, which is how do we help schools, even if the leadership isn't kind of taking the next steps, how do we help support them in that way? But luckily early on, we had a great model because the school brought on 4 folks who kind of covered those areas. And then we gave them some guidance about what to do with the data. So one of the big things we would recommend is use this as a way to observe for yourself what you're seeing. So if you see a parent sharing some feedback about a teacher, just go observe for yourself and see, does the feedback resonate or not? Share the praise liberally, like, create a shout out wall, get all that out as much as you can. But then a lot of the things, actually in the feedback, and that things is surprising for people, is actually about operations. People often assume that teachers are where folks are going to have a lot of feedback. And most of the praise that comes in is for teachers. Most of the feedback is around operations. And so that's just an interesting kind of thing to know and see.
Was there particularly if there was a lot of negative feedback, did that bother people at first? Because obviously people are working, trying to make all this stuff work, and their parents start picking on something. Did that bother people, or was there training involved initially to say, just learn from it?
School administrators and leaders have super thick skin because they get, for better or for worse, they get a lot at them all the time. They were not accustomed to getting positive feedback and to seeing positive things. So that really was kind of the solve, it's, I don't know how you say the word, but it at least lets them know, like, okay, one, we're doing good things. There are people who see what we're doing and how hard we're working. And then they're used to getting the negative feedback. They're just less used to getting it in that kind of constructive way. They're still nervous. Like, they're still nervous before they open the report because you don't know what to expect. Then once you open it, and you're like, oh, wow, there's positive stuff. And I can take action. And it's not just on Facebook where I'm having to passively read this and try to figure out how to solve it. So that's been the experience we've heard from school administrators. They have really thick skin too.
Okay.
Yeah.
And teachers, so they're getting a lot of good positive stuff, which is really good for them.
Yeah.
Because,
and also, I think, part of what's helpful too is a lot of times, because, whether it's media or elsewhere, we sometimes put parents and teachers as, on opposite sides of things. There are quite a few things they agree on. I mean, so there's sometimes policies that happen where you see teachers sharing a set of feedback and parents sharing a set of feedback, and they both think the same thing, but there's not necessarily transparency where we can know that they both want the same thing. So I think that's really important to know, that there are a lot of times where they're on the same page, and it's just hard because there's not a lot of information flowing for us to be able to see that.
Okay, so you started at one school and it seemed to work. What did you do then?
Yeah, so, and the one I wanted to define what is working, and the 2 things were, one, are parents using this platform and kind of this they have stuff to share, is it valuable stuff? And then 2, is it's helpful for the school, like to get better and to do what they want to do. So luckily, kind of both the data and conversations affirmed yes. So then the idea was like, okay, is this worth paying for? Would schools pay for this? So then that was kind of the big push over the summer of 2017. And mind you, I was working a full-time day job while I was doing this. So it wasn't like I quit my day job and did this. This is the thing when you start a company as a person who's older, has kids. And I've, had the benefit of being married, and that definitely helped. But so yes, then we said, okay, well, can we find other schools? And so I mostly through networks found 7 schools across 2 states who signed on for August of 2017. And luckily, 3 of those schools were, well, no, 4 of those schools were in Nashville, and then we had a few in Texas. And it was really important for, I think as an entrepreneur, it's super important. Your first customers are so important. They're taking a bet on you. Because really when they said yes during that summer, then I said, okay, we've got to really go out and get this technology built. I can't go do like 7 SurveyMonkey based, reports every week.
Yeah.
So went out and found a developer to really create the technology that was in my mind based on what I created earlier. And so what I created earlier is in kind of the tech world, considered an MVP, a minimally viable product. But through that model, that's what I was able to give to our developer to then create the technology to create a platform where it can be text message based. It can go back and forth. There's a reporting tool that our reporters can use to make it easy. There's a report. So then we started in August of 2017 with those schools, and we're kind of off the races.
All right, startup capital. Did you need money up front? Was this something you worked with the Entrepreneur Center with, or
yeah? So at this stage, it was still all self-funded. So really, I was working my and luckily by this time I had told my day job, like, hey, I'm working on an idea. I think there's some there. Can I go down to 80%? And I knew I would still be working more than 80%, but I just wanted the right. So
yeah.
Did that, and so really was using a lot of my money from my job to pay for the company. So through 2017, was still self-funding it. And the Entrepreneur Center, I started the pre-flight program with the Entrepreneur Center in August of 2017. And I do think, like, especially because I was working a full-time job, and I share this with entrepreneurs, if you're working a full-time job, I think it is important to enroll yourself in other programs that will kind of give you that competing, responsibility. And so that really helped keep me focused when I started that work with the Entrepreneur Center. And so then we continued to grow through the middle of 2018. By June of 2018, we had 40 schools across 6 states. And that's when I decided, okay, it's time to go full time. I was trying to raise money all this time, but part of what I heard when I was trying to raise money is, well, they need to see you're full time to know you're serious. You need a tech co-founder. You need this, you need that. And so part of why I went full time at the time was the belief that it would help with fundraising. So, yeah.
All right. So you went full time in 2018?
2018.
And obviously, you started with 7 schools, some here in Nashville, some here in Texas. But you jumped pretty quickly from 7 to 40. So how did that happen? Did word get out about this concept and people started going like, wait a minute, we want to do that too?
Yeah, what was great is, so, as I brought on the 7 schools, I started to need people to do the reporting. And that's where that kind of whole idea of reporters came. And so I hired 6 part-time people who were doing reporting, but then I also was like, hey, y'all should do some sales too. So really it was them, and kind of, again, they weren't experienced salespeople. Most of them truly were moms who had been teachers before and were now kind of wanting to go back into the career force, but didn't have, the ability to do a full-time job. So really one of the things that made me realize I should go full-time was when we had our first sale that wasn't like where I wasn't involved. I didn't know the school and they didn't know me. And so I was like, okay, so if someone who doesn't know me and someone who's not me is selling to someone who doesn't know me, then that says to me that we've got a product that can sell. And so from there, yeah, really that really did kind of jumpstart some of the next step with just word of mouth. Now, saying MMPS, that was part of what happened also, was we started working with a couple of schools in MMPS, and those schools started to tell other metro schools about the impact and what was happening there. And part of what was really neat to see, where that was, some of those schools were schools that were in the priority zone, have been considered failing. And so part of the challenge when you're leading a school as a principal that's been kind of given that label is you have to wait till the end of the year to see if that label is going to be taken off of you or not. And it's all about your test scores. And so what they were able to see through Convo during the course of that year is they were able to see parents saying things like, I can see the improvements this school is making. My child comes home talking about the curriculum. And so they were able to celebrate their successes along the way, and then also see that their parents were engaged in ways that they didn't know that their parents were engaged. They were like, oh, they were pleasantly surprised that the curriculum, what was being taught made it home, and that parents really noticed that difference. So I think that's really important as we think about the experience of schools. So we've kind of created a space where schools evaluate themselves by an end of the year test score. And of course, that means a whole year has gone by before we're really saying, like, is the school kind of, doing the best it can? But it also can make it really hard for schools and teachers to feel successful for a whole year because they're waiting for one number to tell them if they're successful or not.
Is the way your model works, is it, can a school kind of can they change the way they ask the questions? Can they tailor it to their own school and add questions to the model? Is that how it works?
Kind of. So we've got a standard set of questions, and then they can ask. We have one question that schools can tailor, and part of it is because we want to track sentiment over time. So that's the sentiment question, are you happy? We suggest they ask that at least monthly, so they can kind of track it, have data tracking over time. And then they can ask any question they want. They can, so sometimes schools will say, hey, parent teacher night's coming up. What questions do you have? Do you feel comfortable walking into the office? What teacher is your child talk about? So any number of questions. And, especially during the pandemic, they use it to ask, are you comfortable returning to in-person? What do you think we need to focus on with ESSER funding? So all sorts of questions. So, but we try to keep it pretty standard. One, so that people know what to expect, and so they can know, like, okay, here's where I'm going to have the opportunity to share. But then also, one of the things we've noticed is, because we're as educators, I think we overassume the percentage of the adult population that's college educated, and so only about a third of the adult population is college educated. And what we found is a lot of times schools and districts will ask pretty academically complicated questions.
Yeah.
And so we try to make sure that they're accessible to the 6th grade level and translate well and all those things. So that's part of why we keep it partially standard and a little bit flexible.
So let me ask you this. How many schools do you have now within your program?
We have about 1,500. It's growing every week. So we're in 34 states. Yeah. So,
and how many employees do you have?
18 full-time and about 30 part-time.
That's amazing. Okay. So it is booming. All right. So do you share data between schools? Can they look at what other schools are saying, or is it personal to the individual school?
So a district sees a dashboard that has the sentiment, like the happiness rates, response rates, and so a district can compare. And so then it would be up to the district administrator, for example, wanted to get their cluster together and say, all right, let's look at our results together. They could do that, but an individual school only has an individual school's data.
All right. And do you see? I love the idea that you make sure that you tailor the question so people can understand the question. Do you see differences in school areas about the number of people who actually, respond back? I mean, are some better than others, obviously?
I think what's interesting, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's okay. I was going to say, do you all watch that? And let's say that you only get 30% feedback initially from the school. Can you do that? And do you have ways to get more people to respond back and be a part of it?
Yeah, definitely. So we see differences between districts, between states, between schools, and there are a couple of different things. So some of it is, one example is we found in a district that we work with that, like after 1 or 2 pulse checks, the response rates at their more affluent schools would be, 30%, 40%. We also work with less affluent schools, and those schools can get to the same response rate. It just takes them a few more, what we call at bats. So that's one, is giving parents more opportunities to share. We also found that tweaking the questions a little bit, and this is kind of something the teachers, know, which is scaffolding. So sometimes if the question is too complex, or they don't have enough background knowledge to make the question so that it's accessible to them and where they are. So those are things. The other thing is getting contact information updated. And a lot of folks know that this is a challenge schools face, but some schools have better systems for keeping up-to-date contact information for parents than others. So that's definitely a big driver in response rates. One of the things that's helpful is, we can identify that more quickly and give that information to the school so that they can know whose contact information they need to get updated. But this is a funny kind of story of just how the world works. So we had a pulse check with a district that was not in Minnesota. But the person responded, he said, I live in Minnesota. I've been getting these calls from this district, and how can I get off of this? But part of the thing is, again, to the point about outbound, no inbound way, there had never been a way for this person to share back. I did not have a child in this district. So contact information is a very big deal for school districts in terms of making sure that's up to date. So those are all drivers for response rates by schools, but there are also cultural things that I think, and I have a hypothesis, we don't have enough data to prove this out. I think there's probably a correlation between response rates and voter enfranchisement or disenfranchisement, which is to say, I think probably parents who are less engaged probably also feel less engaged and more disenfranchised as voters. But again, we'll need more data to look at to kind of figure out those connections.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. Suppose let's be any school district. Suppose that you reach out, you have people's email information, so you're reaching out or texting, or do you do it email and text, or can you do?
Okay. We do, yeah.
All right. So let's say you have information. Can your system detect if somebody really is not responding? And is there a way to try to get them engaged in what's going on?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about that. There is, so we try asking questions different ways, asking different questions. Sometimes they're just content, sometimes they're busy, sometimes they don't, so we don't think that 100% of parents need to reply, but we do like to see over time at least 60 to 70%, because that's a high likelihood that every child can be represented. But yeah, so that is something we spend a lot of time. We call them non-responders, and we try to figure out different ways to get them back. And then we also partner with our school and district partners. So schools sometimes can test, they can come from a staff member instead, or one of the things we find and hear from parents is like, if a teacher reinforces that it's important or why it's important, then that'll also increase response rates. So kind of lots of things to test. And we're starting a project with some Columbia researchers to figure out what are some of those things that help elicit response rates or increase response rates. What are the different treatments we can give to different people? And there are a lot of things to borrow from the healthcare space, where you try to figure out how to get people to take, practices that will improve their health outcomes. So we're it's definitely a thing we spend a lot of time.
Yeah, lots of different things going on. Let me ask, and you may not have gotten this, but it sounds like you all have been spending a lot of time talking about, you worry about children in schools whose parents are either too busy or just not involved. Is there a way to, particularly if you're seeing a child, or the teachers are seeing a child struggling in school, is there a way to use your format, your system, to kind of say, well, okay, so this child's struggling, parents really aren't a part of this, they're not responding or doing anything, and working on trying to energize that communication?
So we see parents involved. What we see when parents share feedback is there's a lot of things that they're able to share that might be a lens or dimension that might be missed. So even if parents don't respond, we don't necessarily assume they're not involved. I think that, what we see is they're involved parents who don't necessarily respond to the pulse checks, but just people have different, ways of operating. But to your question, there are a couple of things that are really beneficial. So one is a parent can share a perspective on that might be affecting another child. A teacher, we do staff pulse checks, so teachers can also share things that might get lost kind of in a bigger system, and they can share what they might be seeing. But it really is giving, and we do student pulse checks, and that's really amazing, because then what we see is they are also able to speak up and speak out when they're seeing things that might be affecting a student. So part of our theory is that, schools are kind of three-legged. You need the parent, you need the student, you need the staff and the teachers. And so if you can get all of those perspectives in, then you're not over reliant on just one perspective. Because teachers, I remember when I was a teacher and I would see 150 students each day, and classes were 50 minutes. And so you just kind of are like in and out, in and out. And so it's so hard to lean in. But then if a parent was able to share, hey, I see my kid struggling, then I could be like, oh, okay, I see that too. Let me lean in. So I just think that it's so important to have those diversity of perspectives, the students, the families, and the staff, for us to really help schools be successful and help students be successful.
This is it's such a good concept, such a very good information tool, and it's helping. It would seem it would help the teachers, it would help the administrators, it helps the parents, ultimately helps the students. Go back for a second. Was it hard to get this thing started? I mean, how did you raise the funds? Was it hard raising the money to get this stuff done?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest challenge has been, of all the things, it is hard. It's fun. I feel really fortunate because I don't know that all entrepreneurs find their journey fun, and I've definitely had fun. Fundraising is not fun.
Yeah,
I've not
no,
found that.
never is. So
Well, it's interesting because I had done nonprofit fundraising and I actually did enjoy that, and I thought there would be more similarities than there are. There are not very many similarities, well, there's similarities in like all sales, which is like getting comfortable with rejection, being willing to make the ask. I think those are things that are definitely the same. Um, I think part of why it's not, but why I didn't love it, why I don't love it, is probably a little bit that, I can get in my head as a Black woman raising, if you get a rejection, every entrepreneur is getting rejection. Like that's just part of the path. But then as a Black woman, then you start to ask yourself, okay, I know fewer than 2% of funding goes to, I think it's Black owned. So there's a fraction, and there's a Black woman, there's a fraction. So then you start to, there's a reality that you have to contend with. And then there's also what's happening behind and trying to figure out and parse out what's what. And so it's not helpful necessarily to get caught up in that space, but it is the reality. So I'd say fundraising has been a challenge. I've been very fortunate. We've raised over $4 million, which is, unfortunately, there are not as many Black women who've been able to raise that much money as should be. And there's a lot broken in the system of investing in companies. But I'm very fortunate with who has invested. They have the right mindsets. They're luckily people who also are not just focused on a financial return, but they're also focused on impact. And so that creates a lot of ability for us to make the best decisions, again, not just for the company, but for the schools and districts that we work with. And so yes, that's been part of the journey. But, I mentioned earlier, I was self-funding, and then I quit my day job in June of 2018. And so then by then the POSIT bank account and the Shani bank account, our personal bank accounts, they were all going south. And so, and so it was in December of 2018 that we got our first investment. And I tell people all the time, the reason the angel investment space has changed a bit, but true angel investors, like when you really have that experience, you're like, oh, this is really like an angel, like because they're believing in me and believing the best in me and in our company, and so that makes a big difference.
well, I'm getting notes that say you're the first Black woman in Tennessee to ever raise more than $1 million. Is that right? As far as you know?
Yeah. Now we have two. A friend of mine now was the second, which is great. She's out of Memphis. And so I think it's an important reminder too of, us kind of once you got the first ones. That's why, even though, people we don't always love like when we kind of celebrate all the first, but the reason why it helps is because then it helps someone else say, okay, it's possible. And so ideally we just continue now there's so many, I mean, not now, there have been so many amazing Black owned and Black led businesses, but I think Nashville and Memphis are really just seeing amazing growth. I think, Slim and Huskies, like those very visible examples help. But we've hired 4 tech software developers from a company called Cultural Avid. It was called Mintech Agency, that's led by Karen Williams. She started out of the EC Black woman-led company. And so there have been so many companies that we've, Erica Hartwell at NODAP, she supported us and helped us early on as we were figuring out our social media. So there's so many companies that are growing and developing in the ecosystem. And it's neat to be able to, like I told Karen, I said, our company is better because of the company that you have. So, yeah.
All right. Well, so you're a systems changer. I mean, you're changing not only tech systems, but changing the way a lot of these things were looked at. From a business standpoint, particularly from getting capital in to start new businesses, how would you change our system? I mean, you look at metro government, and we talk about we need more minority business participation. That's like, well, let's do it. Let's figure out what the problems are and then go fix them. I mean, you want more minority-owned businesses getting capital to get started. Are there things that we should be changing to get that money through?
Absolutely. So there are a few things. One is knowledge. So what's out there, what exists. I think there's a fair amount of information about what's out there. But as you talked about metro government, one of the things that I think about is what are the issues that Metro government's trying to solve? And so, as a company, you can't help, but Metro government has a huge budget. There are minority businesses who could probably help Metro government solve some of their problems if they knew what the problems were the Metro government was trying to solve. And so I think there's that level of information, making sure folks have the information. But then in terms of funding, the reality is the people who are going to most likely fund and invest are either individuals or some level of a company. And what incentive do they have to invest in their fund? Minority-owned businesses, Black-owned, Latino-owned businesses. Right now, they don't have much of an incentive, and so they go to kind of what's most safe. And typically, what's most safe is the person who they've worked with and the people who they've worked with. And so, when you peel back when you just kind of scratch the surface of a lot of the companies that have, gotten funded and grown, it can be a little bit disheartening because it is very much so good old boys. And so I think the only way around that is to create a counteracting incentive where they would want to take what would be considered a risk. I don't think it's a risk any more so than whatever they're already doing. But I think and I think the third part is helping. So a lot of people who are new to Nashville who actually have the money and who would be willing to invest, but they're new. And so it's hard to know as an entrepreneur, it's hard to know who they are, even in the Metro government. So I think once we kind of know who's coming in, who has that kind of capital and getting them well prepared to invest in our growing businesses, I think that'll make a big difference.
Well, so I know obviously you've got a lot of spare time on your hands, but the concept of, I don't know if Metro government, when they're looking for vendors, or even if they issue a request for proposals and get vendors in, why wouldn't you use a system like what you've got, either before or after, to send information out, get the information back in, but not only give it to the procurement, but give it to mayor's office, the city council, to understand what the problems are. Why are we not getting minority business participation? There's an idea for you. So when you have nothing else to do with your current business, it just seems like there's so much of a lack of communication. We're going like, why are people not participating? But there could be.
I mean, on the staff side, one of the things that's been great as we started to work with staff is staff members also know a lot about what's going on. So I don't know how many employees Metro employs? I don't know. Lots. Lots. Well over thousands. But what systems do they have to share what they're seeing, what they know? But I think that gets back to supporting businesses. There's revenue and then there's investment. And so certainly as a big on the procurement side, making it easier and for businesses to both know what the opportunities are, but then access the opportunities when they are, so that, because even revenue is even better than investment, to be honest, because that's when you're really like creating your own future and trying your path yourself. So
Well, but I'd also say particularly for government, for city council, we tend to get lots of emails on a particular thing.
Yeah.
That will drive our focus to, okay, this one's got people's attention. But there are lots of other things out there that we don't necessarily know. And we also, are getting it email by email. So we don't have one central place to go, wow, this year budgetary concerns, we're getting thousands of responses. They're all tied into one report. And you can go, that's the issue that people are most concerned about right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I may be talking to you later about expanding the program.
I love it.
All right, so go back for a second. Go back to the information flow that goes on, and let's talk about school safety. Is your tool a method to understand parents' concerns, their children's concerns about going to school? And are you seeing that? And are there things that can be done to be helpful?
All of the above. Yes, absolutely. So a couple of things. So on school safety, there's the kind of physical building, and then there's the kind of psychological safety of being in there. So we hear and see from parents about both. One is parents will say, and this is again long before, because when you have a school building with parents, you've got 500 additional eyes at least. And so they'll say, hey, this back building is always propped open. That's not safe. these lights never work. And when it gets dark at 4 o'clock, so that's the physical building. And then there's also the psychological safety, and then particularly through both parent pulse checks and student pulse checks, they talk about those things. So whether that's bullying or curriculum, there are different ways that students feel kind of safe and seen. And we try to identify what is the theme of what parents want for themselves and for their child, and it really is to be seen. I think that gets the psychological safety, to be seen. But on the physical safety, absolutely. And parents get worried from a couple of lens. One is like I mentioned, the physical building, but then also the school culture and the student discipline. And so I think the student discipline is something that's really important for us to think about from multiple dimensions, because I think part of what happened over this past school year is when, we saw the adults behaving badly, and airplanes, flight attendants having to keep people off of airplanes. So just the adults didn't have their social skills and social cues back, and we still are working on that. But students came back in also and didn't have their social norms ready. And it got really hard for teachers really fast because they didn't have the tools or the supports that they needed to be able to create the types of cultures that they thought were important for learning. And so you could hear both that feedback from teachers and from parents, really a cry for help of having better systems for and culture for students. And that's where typically in education, things are not as straightforward and simple as they seem. I only say that to say because there is some interconnection between what was happening. So a lot of folks came back and were like, okay, our students are really far behind. We need to really focus on academics and press that hard. And the reality is you had a ninth grader in a ninth grade body with a seventh grader inside because they hadn't been in school for 2 years and hadn't gone through those developmental stages. And so that how they were acting out was partially connected to the safety, but it was also connected to the academics. But it's an important way for parents to be at the front lines of sharing what some of the risks are on the school safety side. And I think I'll be honest, I'm one who probably underestimated some of the feedback parents shared about the physical building, but I do think, knowing when doors are being propped open or what doesn't lock or all those things, those are important things for a school to know and to be able to solve and take action on. And it's important that it not be just one person who, it's one person who's responsible for fixing those problems, but there's so many things to see. So to be able to have the help of a parent community, a student community, a staff community to also tell you what's going on is super helpful.
Yeah, I think that's so important. All right, we have a few minutes left. Give me, and I know school safety is so important at this point, but overall, share something interesting where, if you can do that, where parents, something happened, information got sent back, and the school changed something. And you don't have to give me the school name. Is there a really interesting story that you've got?
Well, a couple of them. Well, one, multiple districts, I think, learned some really important things when they were doing school reopening or during the pandemic. They learned one that parents had a lot of, we know this all, but back in June of 2020, a lot of school districts had no idea that parents had such different perspectives and views on school reopening. And so when we were working with districts to do pulse checks, a number of districts realized that one, it's almost like a 50-50 split, but it's very different. No, depending on the district, it was 60-40 or 70-30, but there were also very widely differences in terms of the school affluence. So I think that's one, in terms of just their decisions to reopen. One interesting one also is during virtual learning, we were working with a partner who both did staff pulse checks and student pulse checks, and they were having kindergartners go from 8 to 3 on Zoom. And so one of the feedback they heard from parents was, that's really too long for my kid to be in front of a computer. But they thought that that's what parents wanted. On the other side, they heard from teachers, like, this is really hard to do this from 8 to 3, but teachers thought it was what parents wanted. So then it was, again, one of those times where it's like, okay, well, we can see that this is what, neither of them want this. And they were able to create a system that was helping both of them. Another one of our partners asked teachers during this past year, hey, what can we take off your plate that'll improve student learning? And they got comments back, they took action, and then we're able to see teachers saying, hey, thank you for hearing from me. This made a big difference for me. Another example on Napier Elementary, this was a couple of years ago, but they heard from parents who wanted before care. I can't remember if it was before care or preschool, but there was an actual program that they wanted. They didn't know parents wanted it, and when they found out parents wanted it, they started it. So that's the other thing that's really neat about a lot of school administrators is they are people of action. So they can take an action if they've got like a kind of directed channel. And so that's been really neat to see that as well, just the types of actions that school administrators and district leaders take when they're given the information.
Good information. All right, last question. Where do you see where is POSSIP going to go from here? Obviously, the number of schools, I mean, has just expanded greatly. Where do you go? Where do you go from here?
You were kind of in the land of the future earlier. So we're definitely going to stay in K-12 for forever. But we do see this as something that can exist in other places. And really how we see it is in places where people's voices need to influence the system, but they're diverse and dispersed. And so it's hard for the system to hear from them. So you think about workplaces where people have large workforces that are diverse and dispersed. How do you help them hear from their people? And so that's really where we see us growing. So we'll continue to grow in K-12, and then we'll go into other sectors as well. So that's why I said you're definitely in where we see the future. And part of the beauty of working with schools is you work with all the humans. And so getting that type of experience is very unique. And so we're excited to continue to grow in that way so that, every person can feel like they have a voice and agency. And
Shani, Dowell, thank you. This has been really interesting. Congratulations on, first of all, on the concept, and also on taking something that actually is very, very important and then going with it, sticking with it through some hardships, and then creating something that is a very, very important tool for everybody. So well done. Very good.
Thanks for, I see some friends and familiar folks in the chat, and some new folks. So great to meet everyone.
Well, this has been very, very interesting, and good luck with everything. This sounds good. And I think we'll be in touch because there's so many ways that you can use this tool. So again, congratulations.
Awesome.
And keep up the good work. I see great things happening. Two things before we get off. One is Jenny Matthews from A Step Ahead is going to be our guest next week. So tune in. That should be really, really interesting. And second, Shani, at some point I'll call you and I'll bring over some of my artwork. Okay.
Oh, awesome.
Sitting on the floor up in my attic or upstairs, and you can throw it all out. Yeah. And look at it and go, I don't want that stuff. Again, thank you. Everybody have a good rest of the weekend. Have a great week ahead. We'll see you next week with Jenny Matthews from A Step Ahead. Shani, again, thank you. Everybody be safe. We'll see you next week.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay, bye.